Shirley, how many people eat honey? How many people are fussy about what sort of honey they eat? Why are you fussy? Is it the variety, or does it need to be hard, or does it need to be soft? What sort of things make you a honey connoisseur?
Taste is one.
Taste.
When you're putting honey into food and cooking, or when you're just spreading it on your bread.
Right. How many people know about honey quality and what the quality of the honey is in the jar? There's a few less hands. Okay. Well, as Shirley said, we're and Virginia. Thanks, Virginia. We're a company that is an old company. Peter Bray is the. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Is the principal of the company, and his focus is about no compromise. So, if you want to know anything about the honey in any jar, we can tell you about it, and we can tell you what's in the jar, where it's come from, and the quality of honey. And that's both the opportunity and the problem in some ways. And so, as a company, being a New Zealand company, we're working in an environment where it's pretty typical with most primary producers. We're all clamouring over the same markets really, and we're also trying to find and explain and communicate our point of difference. So this is the market that we're working in. This is a graph. We test, you'll see it later, but we test an awful lot of samples of honey as well as our competitors. And the environment that we're working in is, I don't know if you know, but honey is like vegetables. It can be damaged by heat. And consumers aren't normally aware of this, and there's a lot of honey out in the marketplace that's been severely damaged by heat. And you know what it's like when you overcook your vegetables. All of the goodness is left in the pot and nothing's left in the vegetables. So we measure the HMF in honey, and that's a graph of just what is being sold in the marketplace in New Zealand and abroad for heat damage. Here's another issue. Manuka honey, we all know about Manuka honey. How many people know how much Manuka's in the jar? Is the label on the jar represented by the product in the jar? And how do we know that? And there's very little information getting through to consumers. First of all, the understanding, we just assume that it's Manuka. We haven't developed a method of being able to remote control bees to the Manuka flowers. They've got a mind of their own, and there's a lot of them. So that they go to the flower that they choose, typically the closest one, or sometimes they'll fly over Manuka to something a little bit more tasty. So the only way you can tell what's in the jar is by testing the honey. So this is the graph of again, 50 samples of other Manuka brands and 50 samples of Airborne honey, and that's the results of what's in the jar. 75% of all Manuka sold when that graph was generated, what isn't Manuka honey by the International Codex standard. So what's the difference with Airborne honey? Well, we're the oldest New Zealand honey company, and we're also probably one of the oldest internationally traded honey companies in the world. We're not aware of an older brand out there. There's probably a number of local brands that are older than us, but we're old. Every living generation of New Zealanders has had the chance to eat Airborne honey, although I did see on the news the other day that there's a lady in Southland that's 110 years old, so she may not have started on Airborne honey. And the founder, William Bray, was the editor of the first New Zealand Beekeeper newsletter. So what do we do? So often it's always good to set a standard that isn't our own standard, and sometimes we're a bit guilty of that in New Zealand. So at Airborne honey, we apply the standard of the International Codex, which is adopted by many countries in New Zealand, and New Zealand's a signatory to that standard. We test every single batch of honey that comes into our laboratory every year, and to date we've tested over 31,000 samples of honey, and we have one of New Zealand's largest honey vaults based on honey data alone. The New Zealand universities and international laboratories use our database for referencing honey type. And the other thing we do is that we test honey for multiple factors. We have this saying at Airborne honey: if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, has a broad bill and webbed feet, then it's a duck. If you put a different beak on that bird, it's probably not a duck. And so that's how we test honey. You don't have one factor that makes honey Manuka or Reruera or whatever it is. You've got to use a number of tests to identify really what is in that jar. We've introduced it, and this is our attempt to try and to educate and tell consumers about the quality of honey, because it's an area that a lot of people don't know about. So we've introduced really what is a world first honest, undamaged and traceable label, and in an attempt to get consumers to start to select and pick honey on quality points that we think are important when selecting food. And we know in the case of China, our consumer is 34-year-old, female, well educated, into a little bit of leisure, and very particular about the quality of food that they're feeding their family. And I'm not so sure about the age, but certainly in New Zealand and other markets, we are becoming much more conscious about the quality of food that we're sticking in our mouths. And the reality is that we don't know a lot about the quality of that food that we're sticking in our mouths, and this is our attempt to start that process with honey. So in the case of what we're testing for pollen. We test to 4 to 5 pollens. We also test the honey for heat damage. We're testing the natural sugar profile on honey. As we know, honey is a complex set of sugars. And we test the colour, as well as a number of other things. This was a recent target episode on when they tested honey to see whether the honey in the jar was actually Manuka. And one of the measures for Manuka honey is it has to be 70% Manuka pollen. As you can see, out of the 5 companies that were tested, Airborne honey was the only one that met the standard. And not too many consumers know this. And so when you're buying honey, you might be paying $20 for a jar of honey, but is it really Manuka, particularly Manuka honey? So, you know, there's a real opportunity for cheating, if you like, if you're going to put an expensive honey with a cheaper honey and try and extract your value. So how do you know? One of our technical features at Airborne honey is a patented system where we are able to produce the most natural, undamaged honey possible, because like vegetables, you can, it's a time and temperature thing. So it doesn't matter if the temperature is high for a short period of time, like blanching, for example, that's less damaging than if the temperature is low for a long period of time. Conversely, if the temperature is very high for a shorter period of time, that damages honey. It's the same with vegetables. Think about it in terms of vegetables. We've got a process where both the time and the temperature is about 25 to 30% lower than the industry standard, which means that we're retaining the natural goodness of the honey right through into the jar more than any other honey company. Here's an example. The HMF is what we measure for heat damage. The Codex standard is 40, so it's the lower the number the better. The New Zealand average heat damage, which was that chart I showed you earlier, is 27. Airborne's average is 6. So that shows that that honey is as fresh and as undamaged as almost as close to the way you get it out of a beehive. Traceable. It's not so much an issue in New Zealand, but it is a bit of an issue overseas. We can trace every single drop of honey in every jar back to the beehive that it came from. We can also tell you how far, as the crow flies, every drop of honey has travelled from the beehive to our factory and on from there. In New Zealand, the regulations prohibit the import of honey from anywhere else. So the only issue around traceability is whether, you know, that honey that's in the jar, is it Manuka and is it something else from 2 different locations in New Zealand? But the real issue or the real opportunity overseas is they have these labels that say from EC and non-EC countries, and it's got a honey, maybe even New Zealand honey, for example. Now that's a pretty broad characteristic. That could be, I don't know, New Zealand honey and Chinese honey. I was told by a leading supermarket in Germany the other day, or before Christmas, that, you know, what is the composition of German honey? And he said, well, it's up to 75% Chinese honey, 25% domestic honey, or New Zealand honey. So consumers have no idea about what is in that jar. Supermarkets are driving us towards low price points, and as a result, it's the price that's dictating what's ending up in that product. It's not the quality or the origin of the honey. Now, if I'm a consumer, I'm pretty sure I want to know where that honey's come from, and if I'm paying a premium for New Zealand honey, then I want to know that I'm getting all New Zealand honey in that jar. And what Virginia pointed out is that, you know, we've got a wonderful opportunity in New Zealand to promote what is a premium quality product. We are probably one of the highest priced honeys in the world, and we've got to retain that reputation. And if consumers are getting a whiff of the fact that it could be 25% New Zealand and 75% Chinese honey, I'm not sure that that's good for our image. So this is our attempt at communicating to consumers with what we call our honest, undamaged and traceable. Honest is the pollen percentage. Honey's not an easy subject because each honey variety has a different pollen percentage, and that's largely because of the orientation, simply put, of the flower. Flowers that are orientated upwards tend to have all of the pollen sitting in the nectar, so when the bee goes back to the beehive, it carries a lot of that pollen. So that's a high pollen count honey. It'll have typically 60-70% pollen in it. Then flowers that are more orientated, you know, horizontally like that, some of the pollen's there, and often a lot of it's gone. So you're getting a clover honey as an example of that, where to have 45% clover pollen is good. That's the minimum standard by Codex. And then you get a flower that's pointed to the ground like a tari or one of these other types, where 10% pollen gets back to the hive. So when you see a honey like a taru, we'll put 10% pollen on it. That's actually very good for taru because most of the pollen's on the ground and it hasn't gone back to the beehive. So, and then that's why we have to use this analogy: walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. So we test the sugar profile, we test the colour, we test whether it's been heat damaged and so on. So these are the other reasons why you've got to test for 5 or 6 parameters. HMF is a measure of heat damage. It's an important number that you've got to remember. If you're wanting to consume honey that hasn't been overcooked, it's got all of the goodness that you want to be getting from the bees, then you need to be buying honey that's undamaged by heat. And then traceable. It's got to be traceable back to the beehive, and if we're updating our website at some stage, and sooner or later you'll be able to put the batch number on the jar in our website and see whereabouts in New Zealand that honey came from. And with Google Maps we can actually zero down and actually see the beehive. So we believe, I mean, as Virginia pointed out, you saw China sitting out here, big volume, low price. Little New Zealand, you know, we're good at what we do. We've got some pretty clever technology. We've got a wonderful country, it's pure. We've got a food safety standard that's second to none. And we've got to take full advantage of that. And by compromising our standards around quality or price, we're doing ourselves a disservice. So we think we've got a pretty special company. We think we've got some of the best honey in the world. And so yeah, we're working hard to get the story out. So that's all from me. Well, clearly online is really, I mean, that's a pretty broad subject, I know, but that's the space that we need to be in. And you know, we've spent some time with some pretty clever IT companies around the world, and it's almost a conversation for every valley, really, because you know, New Zealand is a complex area of different climates and different opportunities, and it's trying to get those small stories told and then portrayed out to the market. And I guess the first point is that we've got to be recognised as a company that people trust, and you've got to feel like you can ask the deep and meaningful questions and get a serious answer from. And if you feel like that, that builds that level of confidence and interaction, and I guess that's where it starts. We haven't got Coca-Cola's budget, so it's literally at that level. On the Varroa mite, you know, as New Zealanders, we're pretty good farmers. We're very good at dealing with issues, adopting technology and responding. So with regard to Varroa, you'll see both honey production's increased post-Varroa, the production of kilos per hive is increased as well. So we've been able to deal with the issue, and we've seen growth in response to that. So supply is really a price issue, and you know, if we're going to try and sell our honey at a low price, or we're going to be competing with each other's company on price, we're going to effectively diminish the value perception of the honey in the mind of consumers. So that's the first thing. So The second thing is, if consumers internationally believe our product is the best product in the world and they're getting tangible benefit from it, then the next issue is price. And simply, we've got to be, like you talked about, the spirits and other branded products, we've got to be getting our pricing our product according to the real value and not diminishing that value. So it's just really a matter of ramping up the price, and then it shifts the demographic of consumer. Well, it's a two-pronged attack. One is the quality of the honey in the jar. So if you're talking about, for us, we set a benchmark, which is the codex, which limits our ability to compromise the quality of the honey. So we don't have any ability to address that issue. So without our honey, it'll always meet a certain standard. By reducing the quality of their honey in the jar through blending and other things, that's one way of addressing the profit margin. With a supermarket, it's a difficult environment. We're pretty big in the supermarkets here in New Zealand. We're one of the top 2 or 3 New Zealand honey brands. The difficulty with a supermarket is it limits consumers' choice. And I'll give you an example. We attend the food shows around New Zealand, and the recent Auckland food show, we delivered 7,000 tastings in 4 days. One person tasted about 2 varieties of honey, and so 3,500 people. Of those 3,500 people, about 50% of those purchased a honey because they had never experienced the taste of that honey before. And in a supermarket environment, none of us are going to shell out $7, $8, $10 for a product that we're not familiar with. So while supermarket's great for profile, I'm not sure that it gets to the real heart of what the brand story is. And I think the position of a supermarket in any market nowadays is potentially diminishing with the online community, because essentially if you look at the makeup of a supermarket, it's financing buildings and car parks and a whole lot of other infrastructure. To me, we're better to be putting the effort into building infrastructure around honey quality and information to consumers about the quality. And that's a different area which is developing. Well, it's an interesting conversation. New Zealand is typically where we've come from is what I consider a trading style mentality, where we're selling product into a market and we get it into the market, we get the check, and then we want to sell the next lot of product. We don't want to talk much about, or haven't wanted to talk much about the quality of the product and what differentiates a product. To move to the next level about what we call brand building, that's a whole different skill set. And essentially in that kind of framework is where I think we should be. I believe we've got a brand here that just is right for brand building, and it fits the demographic of consumers that are very concerned about what they're sticking in their mouths. The how is the difficult bit, and that's the bit that we're learning very fast to do. But that's essentially the move that we're going to. Telling the wonderful story about New Zealand flora and fauna that isn't available anywhere else in the world. Producing honeys, you've just got to go to a food tasting event, which is one sale at a time almost, and get the reaction of New Zealand consumers to our wonderful honey varieties, and it's just incredible. But it's telling that story one taste at a time almost. And, it's a problem in New Zealand, product by product. It's very difficult to corral farmers essentially and their product. We're independent people. We're very proud of our own product and our own name. And at the end of the day, I'll say yes. Let's make it an industry standard. Let's make it an airborne standard. But just by doing that, you've cut out the other 75% of the Manuka brands based on that graph. Now that's a dollars and cents issue, which cuts to the heart of this whole subject. The New Zealand red meat industry's facing the same issue. We've seen successes around Zespri and Fonterra. We've got issues with Enza in terms of where it was and where it is now. It's a problem, and my solution is that we, as a company, have to win the war of public opinion, and that's to me where the nub of it lies. Is that it's our job to convince the consumer that ours is the best quality product, and whatever's the best quality product. It's no different to what's coming out of some of these old traditional European brands. and so on. They've developed a position in the market because of some IP or something that's got through to consumers that they've bought into and trust. I think that's where it fits. Briefly, first of all, Manuka honey has to be Manuka honey by the Codex standard. That's the Airborne view. Essentially, there's two antibacterial functions in Manuka honey and other honeys. They fit into two chemicals. One is methyl dioxyl, which is typically under the non-peroxide brand, under the non-peroxide test, or hydrogen peroxide. So that there's two. You could get one of two antibacterial activities. We're in the hydrogen peroxide camp for a raft of reasons. Some of the major brands in New Zealand are in the non-peroxide camp for their own reasons. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about that subject, but all I'll say is there's two antibacterial substances. You go and do your own research on Wikipedia. Methyl glyoxyl, I'll be testing your spelling afterwards. Hydrogen peroxide, and that's the two main active. So broadly speaking, honey falls into two main categories, into monofloral categories like Manuka, Taru, Rewa Rewa, Clover, etc. And if you are buying an Airborne brand, it will be the same taste every time because it will be selected on data. Then you've got our liquid cream clover, creamed bush range, as well as the signature range. These are blended honeys. And so with a blended honey, it's a range of different honey types that, for a creamed honey, it's based on a sugar profile, so that it'll cream up nicely, which there's nothing added in creamed honey, it's just the hastening of the crystallization process. The issue with creamed honey is that, or even liquid honey or blended honey, is that you need to know that it hasn't been damaged by heat. You need to know it hasn't been ultra filtered, so all of the pollen stripped out of it. A lot of companies strip it out to stop the crystallization in the case of liquid honeys. The honey on the table here, this Craig's honey, it's actually a Watties product, it's our honey. The reason why they've chosen our honey is because we select it based on its glucose-fructose ratio, so it retains the natural goodness, as opposed to companies that would strip out all of the pollen and heat the crap out of it to make it sort of, last for 100 years. That's completely natural, untouched honey in that, and so we've done it on the selection basis. So when you're buying a blended honey, it is a sort of multi-floral honey, so you'll get different flavours.